Welcome back everyone. So this is another video in our series of videos about the settlement of Australia by European people. So last video we looked about what it was like for convicts to travel over from England to Australia, mainly on the First Fleet. And so this time we are going to look at the journey to Australia for free settlers, so people who had chosen to move to Australia for a better life and what it was like for them to travel over from England to Australia. So in the previous video we talked about how horrible it was to travel aboard the ships from England to Australia as a convict, and to be honest it wasn't that much better for free settlers either. You would think that if you're voluntarily moving you might get some better treatment, but it still was a horrible experience for those moving from England to Australia. It was a long and hazardous voyage. There was risk of fire because they were travelling in wooden ships, a high risk of icebergs, hitting icebergs, and of course there were storms as well. Many people suffered from seasickness as the ship moved up and down during storms. But unlike the convicts, there was the availability of some pleasant activities for the free settlers while they were travelling over to Australia. So of course they could engage with conversation. They also partook in sketching or wrote letters to people that they had left behind at home. They also played card games or other types of games, and even if it was a nice day they were sometimes allowed up onto the deck and went to concerts and dances. So it wasn't all bad for the free settlers when they travelled over from England. Unfortunately, how much you were going to enjoy the journey over to Australia depended on your money situation and how much you could pay to travel to Australia. So steerage was for those travelling under the assisted passage scheme, so that's the lowest class of travel. So people who were travelling under the assisted passage scheme were not paying for their ticket, they were being moved over by the New South Wales government to come and contribute to the Australian economy. People who were staying in steerage, travelling in steerage, were typically on the low deck below the waterline, so they didn't have any windows or anything like that, or portholes so that they could see out. Unfortunately, infectious disease spread quickly because of the cramped conditions, and people also became sick due to contaminated water, which was kept in barrels for the entire journey, and spoiled food. It was much different in first class, so if you were able to pay for a ticket in first class, one of the luxuries was cabins. You didn't have to stay in a large open area with many people. You were afforded a cabin, and there was also a formal dining room. And one of the luxuries of the formal dining room was that they enjoyed fresh meat provided by the livestock on board. So for first class passengers they actually did bring cattle on board that could be slaughtered on board so that they could have fresh meat in their formal dining room. So the picture below is a sketch of what travelling in steerage accommodation would have been like. You can see several features in this picture. Firstly, you'll notice the long table down the centre. This is where most of the passengers ate their meals. And then off to the left and right here you can see the bunks where the passengers would stay. So married couples would typically share the top bunk and children would sleep in the bunk below, and the bunks were less than a metre wide. So they were sharing a bunk for 2 people or more that was less than a metre wide. Over this way you can see there's a little hatch with a person coming down. That was typically kept open during the day for light and fresh air, but it was closed during storms so that the seawater wouldn't pour in to the deck. So you can see at the long table some of them are enjoying a meal. Typically a steerage passenger would have to bring their own bedding, so any sheets or blankets that they wanted they need to bring themselves, and they had to bring their own eating utensils as well. But basic foods such as flour, rice, biscuits and preserved meats were provided for the steerage passengers. So just to get a picture of what it was like in steerage when a storm hit, I've provided the following excerpt from Anne Grafton, who travelled over from England to Australia in 1858. So this is an excerpt from her diary and describing a storm on her way to Australia. So she writes, "Our water barrels were rolling from side to side, and our cans, teapots and cooking utensils were adding to the confusion by bouncing one after the other down the area between the bunks. Some of the young ladies were screaming, and some tried to climb up the hatchway, screaming to the officers to let them out." So you can understand that it wasn't really a very pleasant experience for steerage passengers, but particularly when a storm hit, it was quite terrifying. They were already nervous and terrified about moving to a different country. And basically, during a storm, they were treated like animals who weren't allowed to get out of the undersea cabins. And much of their possessions were rolling about, being quite dangerous. So it was a terrifying experience at times for people travelling in steerage. In the 1840s, there was some positive change for people travelling over from England to Australia. So that came about with the invention of steam engines and the application of those with the use of powering ships. Most of the boats could not carry enough coal to fuel the steam engines for the whole journey, so they were only used in low winds. So at a time where there wasn't enough wind to sail, the engines were turned on to keep the journey progressing. And another innovation came in 1880 when iron ships were started to be used. So previously they were wooden ships, but in the 1880s iron ships were implemented, and they were much safer from fire and much stronger. So icebergs weren't quite as dangerous to the ships, but of course we know they were dangerous, and the Titanic, which was made of iron, still sunk in 1912, so they were still vulnerable to icebergs, but not as badly as wooden ships. The iron ships were also larger, so steerage was also afforded the luxury of small cabins. You would share them with people, but it wasn't the long open room that we saw in the previous picture. And iron ships also included power for electric lighting, refrigeration and ventilation. So there wasn't as much illness aboard because food was kept fresh, and people generally felt better because they had better ventilation systems. So there were some improvements to the travel. But I hope you can see from this video that although it wasn't as bad as being a convict travelling to Australia, it was still quite a horrible and terrifying experience for those people who chose to move from Britain to Australia. They were already nervous about moving to another country and leaving things behind in England, and it was compounded by the fact that many people couldn't afford to travel in first class and therefore had to travel in steerage, which was not great accommodations. They did have some more positive activities such as games and dances, which were not afforded to convicts, and of course there wasn't the punishment system that was applied to the convicts. And then with the 1800s, so the 1840s and the 1880s, of course there were some innovations that improved travel, which continued to the innovations that allow us to travel much more comfortably today.